Okay, I think we can slowly get started. Welcome everyone. It's very nice to see you. It's a great turnout. Nearly the whole SFB seems to be here. And I'm very happy to have this event today with Hassan Ould Moctar. And I will present him more in a second. This event, which is on the recently published book, After Border Externalization, Migration, Race and Labor in Mauritania. This event was organized, or is organized, by the research group, the Production of Knowledge on Migration, which includes Inken Bartels somewhere here, Laura Stierl and Philipp Schäfer, and also Christina Vers, who's I think not here now, and myself, Maurice Stierl. And it's also organized by the Sonderforschungsbereich, the Collaborative Research Center, the Production of Migration. And we are very happy to have Hassan here today as part of the lecture series to present his research on EU border externalization in the context of Mauritania. On the 7th of March last year, the European Commission launched a new migration partnership with Mauritania. You may have heard of that because Commission President Ursula von der Leyen traveled to the country in February 24, promising 210 million euros to Mauritania to support quote, migration management, including the fight against migrant smuggling, as well as to promote security and stability, humanitarian aid for refugees, and support to host communities, end quote. Then in August last year, Spain's Prime Minister Sanchez went to West Africa on a tour to reinforce bilateral relations with Mauritania, Gambia, and Senegal, specifically to counter, again, supposed smuggling of migrants, especially to the Canaries. And I think, by now we know this sort of script of these attempts by Europe to reduce border arrivals and the ways in which these border externalization efforts and agreements come about, specifically when there are these sort of crises over arrivals, as we have seen, especially recently in the last few years, from Mauritania to the Canary Islands. And actually, and I think you will also maybe reflect on that a little bit, there are some estimates that this migration route to the Canary Islands is amongst the most traveled, or maybe even the most traveled on at the moment. So what we also know is that these terms that often use migration management do not really capture what these externalization agreements and policies and migration policies lead to. And for example, and maybe it has not really reached the European public so much in the last weeks, but Mauritania has been the site of collective expulsion campaigns over the recent weeks, with migrants, especially also from Senegal and Mali, being rounded up systematically and deported, often violently. And so we have to think, I think, what happens with and after border externalization. I'm thus very happy to listen to Hassan tonight, whose book is really addressing these issues, right? What happens after border externalization, with border externalization, through border externalization. And I recommend downloading the book because it's open access, published by Bloomsbury Publishing last year, and you can just download it for free. In the book, and I found it a really important read. Hassan talks also about what you call the colonial residue, which I thought was really really interesting term to think about the deep historic arc of colonial bordering and racialized population management, as well as the trajectories of capitalist development. And so, what I also thought was really interesting is that you situate these developments in a moment where I guess it's not sort of European colonialism 2.0, but there's something changing, it seems. And I think you will, I'm not sure whether you'll talk about it, but I thought it was super interesting, this idea that this European dominance is also sort of waning at the moment. We can see this also in the Sahel region, of course, at the moment with the military coups and so on. So it's a very timely and topical issue, I think. And so I'm very excited that we can host you here. Just a tiny biographical note. Hassan Ould Moctar is a lecturer in the Department of Anthropology at SOAS at the University of London. He holds a PhD in Development Studies, which he also got at SOAS, and he held teaching and research positions also at the LSE. And besides this monograph, he is published very widely, and I invite you also to read his other publications, including a special issue to which I also often return, which is entitled Saharan Imaginaries, an Introduction. It was published in 22. So Hassan will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we have another 45 minutes for Q&As. Finally, I should also mention that Hassan will speak tomorrow, also at the IMIS Talks session, between 2 and 3 at the IMIS building, to discuss chapter 7 of this book. It's called Bordering Post-Colonial Capitalism. If you can read it beforehand, if not, it's also okay, and we can discuss it there collectively. And I think you will also give a short input, so everyone is on board. Okay, thanks so much, Hassan.
Thank you so much, Maurice, for the kind introduction, the really helpful contextualization, and for the invitation in the first place. I was really inspired just walking around the hallways of the Institute, seeing this this volume of research on specifically on migration, but not only that, also clearly, judging by the lists of events that are on the walls, migration studied from a much needed critical perspective. So it's an honor and a privilege and a pleasure to be here in front of you, getting to present some of my work, and I'm absolutely sure that I will learn far more from you during the Q&As than you will from me over the next 45 minutes. So during that time, what I thought I would do is just sketch out in kind of broad brushstroke terms, just sketch out the story that the book tries to tell. Before doing that, I might very briefly, just because Maurice already offered such a helpful overview of things that have happened in the past 2 years, but I thought I would maybe just reflect on these developments, since they touch upon how things have changed since the time that I submitted the manuscript, the final draft of the manuscript, which was somewhere around summer 2023. Now, and in doing so, I think this might also just sketch out in broad terms what the object of study of the book is, what border externalization is understood to mean. As we were discussing already earlier, these figures are contested and are very much there are methodological questions around discerning the precise numbers when it comes to disappearances at sea, but there are at least 2 things that I would suggest to be unprecedented irrespective of this opacity. One is the volume of departures from Mauritania to the Canaries, certainly against the time that I did my research, which was 2017, 2018. When it was very much an overland route. The second unprecedented element here is, as Maurice alluded to, the campaigns of raids and deportations that have been unfolding in Mauritania over the past month. And these raids and deportations, both in terms of the volume of people being deported and also the level of violence being deployed, are, judging from what people have been telling me in Mauritania, without precedent. These deportations and raids, I guess, come against the backdrop of yet another unprecedented feature of the migratory landscape, which is the degree of pressure being exercised at various governance levels by European authorities on the Mauritanian state to crack down on arrivals on the Canary Islands. So as we heard from Maurice, we had the visit of the President of the Canaries earlier this year, Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez in August, and a migration partnership deal that was signed around this time last year on the 7th of March between the European Commission and Spain on the one hand and the Mauritanian state on the other. Maurice already outlined the various measures that are promised within this migration partnership agreement. And it's this slew of measures, this package of measures, ranging from militarized security solutions to kind of softer development interventions, all of which are aimed at preventing migration towards Europe at its perceived point of origin. This is essentially what's understood, what I understand border externalization policies to mean. As you can see, this partnership agreement came against the backdrop of what was depicted as a crisis of arrivals, I guess, from the point of view of Spain in the year before last, so in 2023. Now, this strategy of externalization, of outsourcing responsibility for preventing Europe-bound migration to its perceived point of origin is, of course, not confined to Mauritania. Similar such migration partnership deals have been signed with a variety of other North African states over the past 3 years. Tunisia, Egypt, Lebanon, themselves replicating a now kind of infamous deal that was signed with Turkey in 2016. And nor is this strategy of externalization new in the Mauritanian context. So this European Commission press release from the year 2006 outlines a pretty similar package of measures, albeit one that was of a significantly lower financial volume. And that came in the context of trying to prevent what was then depicted as a crisis of arrivals. And for context, that was about 32,000 people registered as arriving on the Canaries in 2006. As we saw on the previous slide, the numbers from 2023 are estimated to be 57,000. So we have this situation in which we're now nearly 20 years into a strategy of border externalization aimed at preventing unwanted arrivals on the Canary Islands, and yet there are unprecedented numbers of people arriving on the Canary Islands, and if we can trust the various statistics, unprecedented numbers of fatalities at sea. So to many scholars, and I'm sure many people in this room, this apparent paradox isn't too much of a surprise, as many have pointed out. Restrictive migration policies in general and externalization policies in particular tend to produce more of what they claim to prevent, more so-called irregular migration, and therefore more of the social condition of migrant illegality. I'm thinking primarily of Ruben Anderson's ethnography of what he calls the illegality industry in West Africa, but this is an insight that people like Nicolas de Geneva have made as far back as 2002, and that itself was building upon other scholarship from a variety of disciplines that indicate the productive nature of migration policies and how they produce the condition of migrant illegality. So, taking that as the broad backdrop, the book poses a pretty simple question of if externalization policies tend to render more people illegal, produce more of this condition of migrant illegality, how does that interact with the historical landscape, the social relations of the contexts in which this process unfolds? So to do this, to address that question, it's necessary to foreground that history and that social context, the social relations in which externalization policies intervene. And the book does so in kind of two broad parts. One kind of historical part that details how these policies intervene with a deeper pre-colonial, colonial, and what we might call a post-colonial context, and detailing, yes, continuities with that colonial context, but also ruptures. The second part is more ethnographic in nature and is based on a multi-sided ethnography of three different locations: the city of Nouakchott, the capital city of Nouakchott, the northern port city of Nouadhibou, and the southern border town of Rosso. And across each of these sites, the question is simply, how does this condition of migrant illegality interact with the social relations that are specific to those sites, but which are also a manifestation of the history detailed in the first part of the book. So, not treating Mauritania and landscapes beyond the border, the EU border, as these kind of blank slates that don't have a prior history before the EU border shows up, but rather foregrounding that history and asking what and how the externalization process interacts with it. So, to do that, the book is very much in dialogue with and inspired by a variety of other perspectives, which in various ways have tried to overcome the Eurocentrism of externalization policies themselves, a Eurocentrism that's empirically kind of manifested in this policy jargon of potential candidates for irregular migration, the assumption that anybody who is of a particular background is liable to migrate to Europe. There's this European directional assumption that inheres in much of the knowledge production and policy architecture of externalization policies. Those Eurocentric assumptions can manifest in scholarship on the on externalization, on the EU border regime more widely. And each of these perspectives in various ways suggest ways around that. It is admittedly a kind of difficult and perhaps impossible task. It might be the case that you need to adopt the premises of your objective analysis, in this case Eurocentric premises, and you acknowledge that and then proceed with the analysis. I think that's a perfectly valid approach, but the book tries to do both the evasion of Eurocentrism while retaining a critical analytical viewpoint on externalization. So, to that end, I thought I would start a bit left field, somewhere slightly different, namely with a voyage that the Sufi scholar Ibn Arabi makes at the turn of the 12th century, in the 1190s, from his hometown of Seville to a variety of locations in North Africa, Marrakesh, Fez, and Tunis. And these physical voyages were part of a broader intellectual and, I guess, spiritual voyage that gave birth to a body of thought that is, in many ways, quite opaque and impenetrable, but which is fundamentally universalist in its outlook. I'll get back to this universalist ontology a little bit later, but what I wanted to draw attention to here is the difference between this particular spatial configuration of the West Mediterranean that Ibn Arabi traveled through in the late 1100s and its contemporary configuration. At that moment in time, it was this contiguous space, whereas today it is the site of this lateral division between the European and African portions of the West Mediterranean. This split between the European and African portions of the Mediterranean, the West Mediterranean, is, I guess, physically bolstered by the border fences that run through Ceuta and Melilla, but I suggest that this is just a material expression of a deeper symbolic boundary that has emerged since in the interim between this voyage that I mentioned of Ibn Arabi's. Now, the nature of this symbolic boundary is alluded to in the work of Samir Amin, who, for those who don't know, is an Egyptian Marxist political economist whose work I was originally drawn to just because of how empirically relevant it is to the context of Mauritania, but he also coined the term Eurocentrism, and given the preoccupation within migration scholarship of avoiding Eurocentrism, I thought it useful to return to the origins of the concept. And he wrote a short book on the topic, as you can see, in 1988, I believe it was published, in which he makes the following observation. The new European culture reconstructs itself around a myth that creates an opposition between an alleged European geographical continuity and the world to the south of the Mediterranean, which forms a new center-periphery boundary, and the whole of Eurocentrism lies in this mythic construct. So the myth of Eurocentrism, which traces this artificial historical continuity between ancient Greek and Roman antiquity, the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, and therefore erases many other aspects of history that are equally constitutive of the present. The Mediterranean is a central geographic boundary. It's a constitutive aspect of this Eurocentric vision. So, in addition to looking at empirically how migrant illegality interacts with social relations in Mauritania, The book is conceptually oriented. I won't say it necessarily answers these questions, but it is oriented by them at least. Questions like, what do border externalization policies have to do with this shifting geography of the Mediterranean? So the transition from this to this. What's the relationship between that transition and externalization policies? Is there any world historical significance in the Mediterranean, which Amin identifies as the foundation of the Eurocentric ideological construct, that it is today the deadliest border zone in the world? And lastly, and I guess most importantly, does the vantage point of Mauritania, which is situated at the margins of this geographic imaginary, does that offer any insight into these questions? And there's a long line of literature about looking at geopolitical formations and imaginaries from the margins. I'm thinking of Cynthia Enloe, Anat Singh, Chet Mainwaring within the domain of migration and border studies. Okay, so to begin answering or addressing those questions, I'll move to a slightly more recent period in history, namely the turn of the 19th century, the year 1902, and the moment of direct colonization in Mauritania. The book details pre-colonial history as well, and looks at three aspects of territorial organization and how they've evolved through the pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial periods of Mauritanian history. But for the sake of concision, I'll draw attention to this moment and a shift in territorial organization that happens at this moment. In very brief terms, this shift consists of what were open frontier zones being transformed into linear borders. This is most pertinent on the Senegal River Valley, where in the 1800s and the 1700s, the Senegal River Valley was a contiguous space of circulation, a single area of governance. At the turn of the 20th century, with the shift in territorial organization, the Senegal River becomes a linear border separating the colonial territory of Mauritania from that of Senegal. As a result of this, human mobility, both nomadic pastoralist mobility that defined movement in the Sahara, but also the mobility of sedentary farmers who were residing mainly on the Senegal River Valley, this becomes transformed into migration which is subject to colonial bureaucratic management and regulation across the Senegal River in particular, but within the internal administrative zones of each of the colonies of Senegal and Mauritania. And lastly, territorial belonging becomes racialized, and in particular, a colonial imaginary that was quite prominent at the time that imagined the lands north of the Senegal River to be the home of so-called white Arab Moors, and the lands south of the Senegal River to be the home of what the French would consider black Africans, so Fulani, Wolof, Soninke populations. This split between the Senegal River, with Arab Moors residing imagined to belong north and black Africans imagined to belong south, becomes operationalized through a variety of taxation and governance policies that kind of mirror the way that Mahmoud Mamdani, for example, looks at the effects of colonial governance structures on ethnic and racial territorial belonging in. He was looking at the context of East Africa. You can say something similar about the context of West Africa. And the consequences that Mamdani drew attention to in the East African context, namely of violence that becomes, and expulsions that become framed as, become rationalized and executed through the language of ethnicity and race. This ends up happening on the in the context of West Africa and the Senegal River Valley as well. In particular, about 60,000 Mauritanian citizens, Afro-Mauritanians, are expelled from the Senegal, from the northern banks of the Senegal River over the course of the from 1989 to 1991. Now, there are other things going on in this spate of expulsions, in addition to the racialization of territorial belonging that happened in the colonial period. There is, for example, a land reform that that transforms the land tenure regime into one of individual private property rights that certain privileged Arab elites are able to take advantage of, and there's also an ecological crisis that creates additional land pressures on the Senegal River Valley. But the fact that these expulsions are executed in the language of ethnicity, saying these black Mauritanians are not real Mauritanians and therefore we can expel them, this, I think, points to the relevance of the racialization of territorial belonging that I mentioned a moment ago. So, to bring this somewhat more up to the relative present, and the year 2006 in particular, this year sees the highest number of expulsions from Mauritanian state territory since the 1980s, what have come to be called the events of 1989 to 1991, with, according to the Mauritanian Interior Ministry, an estimate of 11,637 people being deported over the course of that year. These expulsions came in the context that I mentioned at the beginning of what was depicted as a crisis of arrivals on the Canary Islands, and a response on the part of Spanish police, civil guard and Frontex to prevent these arrivals through the deployment of maritime and aerial assets, through the deployment of Spanish police and civil guard in Mauritania, and through the construction, for example, of a detention centre in the northern port city of Nouadhibou. Now, the fact that all of this is happening with a view to preventing arrivals in the Canary Islands means that the racialized suspicions that resulted in people being expelled in the late 1980s on the basis of not being authentically Mauritanian, this immediately comes to the surface once more. And judging from what people have been saying to me this month, this is happening again at the moment. So this fact of racialized territorial belonging resurfacing as a result of EU border externalization policies does, in one sense, highlight how the legacy of colonialism, the territorial and racial legacies of colonialism, they condition the form that externalization policies take. The book goes into a bit of detail about how this colonial conditioning of externalization plays out in the aftermath of this alleged crisis of arrival, through looking at this migration strategy document that was drawn up in 2010. And it examines how the shift in territorial organization that happened at the beginning of the colonial period ends up being refracted through this policy document. But there are other ways that this colonial conditioning of externalization is, as Maurice hinted at in the introduction, that it's, if not diminishing, and it may well be waning and diminishing, but it's at least shifting in form. This is illustrated in the book through an analysis of the EUTF. I'm sure people are familiar with the EU Trust Fund, so don't need to go into detail about it, but simply to highlight that Mauritania is situated within what it calls the Sahel region and Lake Chad. And this marks a kind of subtle, but I think significant departure from the way that Mauritania has been framed in other governance frameworks with the EU. And in particular, Mediterranean governance frameworks. I'm thinking of the 5+5 dialogue, the Barcelona process, the Union for the Mediterranean, each of which have the Union for the Mediterranean, the 5+5 dialogue, include Mauritania within it, and each of these frameworks are informed by, I guess, what we would call liberal peace-building norms of democracy promotion, human rights, good governance, all of which are framed under a guise of, not even a guise, but a policy language of Europeanization. So the Mediterranean governance frameworks embody this Eurocentric universalism that Samir Amin drew attention to, which, in his words, essentially asserts that the only possible future for the world is its progressive Europeanization. This assumption is very much embedded within the liberal peace-building norms that are embedded themselves within various Mediterranean governance frameworks that Mauritania has been a part of. That Eurocentric universalizing ambition is not at all at play in the Sahel as a geographic imaginary. The Sahel, as many scholars have pointed out, Eva Magdalena Stambol, Philippe Fraud, as a geographic imaginary is more one that is informed by logics of militarization and securitization, and there's a kind of an abandonment of these more Eurocentric, universalizing, liberal peace-building norms like disseminating democracy and good governance and human rights. There are a variety of frameworks that we could point to by way of example. The most relevant, I guess, is the G5 Sahel, which is a regional security cooperation framework that was implemented in 2014, whose permanent secretariat is housed in Nouakchott. And there are a small team of EU policymakers that were staffed there with EUTF funding, whom I interview, whose interview details I go into in the book, essentially looking at how this universalizing ambition plays out in this securitized Sahelian context. Another reason that the G5 Sahel is a relevant example to draw attention to is because of its contemporary status, which is basically one of being moribund. The G5 Sahel has been in a state of crisis since three of its founding states decided to withdraw in order to set up a regional security alliance, but due to a perception of the G5 Sahel being a vehicle for Western and French influence in particular. This was part of a broader spate of both social mobilizations and military coups that have occurred across the region since 2020, I guess, which, as Maurice pointed out, have really shook definitely the French presence in the region of material grants, but also EU capacity building missions and, in certain contexts, the instruments of externalization. EU Cap Sahel missions, for example, have had their material requisitioned in Niger. So, all of this is just to say that if the Mediterranean as a governance framework is informed by these Eurocentric universalizing norms that try to export certain European values to countries outside the EU, the Sahel as a geographic imaginary abandons those governance ambitions and instead is premised on more naked security interests, and it's also a site of unprecedented challenges to those interests and that geographic imaginary, which, whatever else we may make of these developments, certainly mean that the Eurocentric ideological construct that Samir Amin drew attention to is doesn't have the same force of authority, it doesn't have the same hegemony that it did when he originally wrote the book Eurocentrism. So to think a little bit about the epistemic openings that might be at play within this particular juncture, the book takes, as I said, an ethnographic turn, foregrounding migrant agency and in particular taking cues from the autonomy of migration literature to look at how the production of migrant illegality, how this plays out in relation to specific social relations, place-specific social relations, the first of which is the northern port city of Nouadhibou. So this chapter basically situates the experiences and subjective aspirations of illegalized migrants whom I met in the city. It situates these experiences within the political economy of the city. It does so through firstly, just looking at how the assumptions of the autonomy of migration literature, that there is this constitutive tension between Europe-bound movement and an apparatus of control aimed at preventing that movement, how that plays out in this particular context, before trying to expand beyond that, I guess, very binary view of Europe-bound migrants and the apparatus of control, to look at the broader political economy of the city. And this comes to light by looking at the life histories of certain migrants who had tried to get to Europe and who had been deported back to Spain, and looking at how their parents, who were also migrants, how their migratory experience relates to the earlier development and migratory profile of the city. To cut a very long story very short, European capital was very much dominant as the sole economic actor in the early decades of independence, embodied in a mining operation that was located in the north of the city, the north of the country. This port was constructed around the time that the mine was opened in order to facilitate the export of iron ore that was extracted in the mines, facilitate export to Europe. One of the migrants I spoke to, his father worked in the mines, and it's kind of through looking at his life history that this broader history comes to light. This mine was nationalized in the 1970s, and capital today is a lot more transnational in character. A lot of the people that I spoke to who tried to get jobs as day laborers in the city, either on fishing trawlers or in fish meal and fish oil processing factories, they told me about Chinese employers coming to hire them. So, point being, European capital is no longer the sole actor in the city, but the EU still plays a key role due to the way that the illegalization of migrant labor creates, as I'm sure people have already read, a vulnerable and exploitable workforce that transnational capital can draw from. And the transience of this workforce is key in this context because it means that there is a steady stream of migrant labor that can be replenished by transnational capital in the city. Now, this Europe-bound transience is key to the way that illegality interacts with social relations in that context, but this Europe-bound context and Europe-bound directionality can obscure certain aspects of the way that the legacies of colonialism interact with externalization in the city, in the country rather. So for this reason, the subsequent chapter moves to the southern border town of Rosso, one half of which is situated in Mauritania and the other half situated in Senegal. This division is a product of the shift in territorial organization that I mentioned a few minutes ago, and that is sustained by the architecture of externalization in the city in the present. But looking at the literature on the productivity of borders, it becomes apparent that the colonial architecture of externalization that upholds this division between Mauritania and Senegal, it still has to reckon with certain aspects of social relations and dynamics in the country. The prevalence of the informal economy, for example, and the fact that the majority of crossings are there by people who work on one side of the town and who live on the other. So it's not people just moving north, but people engaged in circular movement. The chapter also examines the experiences of people who weren't on the move to Europe when I met them, and who had experiences of border violence in many other parts of North Africa, but who found a kind of degree of tranquility and relative calm in this particular context, because unlike Nouadhibou, there was a relative lack of migration policing within this within the town of Rosso. So they, like the majority of the migrant workforce in the city, were content to work in the rice industry in the city. Some people worked in rice processing factories, others on the rice fields. And by looking at the fact that they were happy to work in this particular context and kind of leave the ambition to go to Europe, leave it aside. This opens a window into the deeper history of the rice industry that people work in the town, that migrant workers in particular work in. So if we recall a couple of slides back, I mentioned these expulsions, about 60,000 people expelled from the Senegal River Valley over the course of the 1980s. A small number of them returned in 2008 within the framework of a UNHCR return program, but they didn't return to their former lands, but rather to an array of resettlement camps that had been set up by the UNHCR that were sprawled across the southern regions of Mauritania. The reason that they didn't return to their former lands was because subsequent to the expulsions, many of those lands had been expropriated by members of the ruling class, the Arabic-speaking Bidan class. For this reason, members of the community that I interviewed said this issue of land restitution is the key demand, and it remains to be resolved. So, while migrant workers in the town are happy to forgo Europe as a destination point and work in the rice industry, this rice industry itself is built upon the expropriation of a returnee community who remain dispossessed and abandoned on the outskirts of Rosso. And this brings together what Sandra Mazzadra might call a diversity of subject positions within the composition of contemporary living labour, and definitely disentangles the view of migrants being these potential candidates for irregular migration, and shows how their subjective experiences and histories relate to these deeper histories of, in this case, dispossession and expulsions that I mentioned a moment ago. This offers an insight, this history of capitalist development in Ouagadougou and this history of racialized territorial belonging in Rosso, together offering ingredients to looking at what this underlying social condition is that furnishes externalization policies with the illegality that, as Ruben Anderson suggests, it requires to justify its existence. So to bring those two aspects together, the final ethnographic chapter moves to the city of Nouakchott, where migration policing was also quite common in this particular context, and where experiences of border violence from other aspects, other parts of North Africa were also quite common. But the more time that I spent in this context, the more it seemed that there was something else in addition to a logic of migration policing that was at play in the interactions between security forces and migrants in the city. So for one thing, due to the legacy of racialized territorial belonging, it was often Afro-Mauritanians who could get caught up in raids and detentions and even threats of deportation. In addition to that, it didn't seem to be at this moment in time, and we can talk about how this has changed in the interim, but at this moment that I conducted my field work, it wasn't so much in people's capacity as migrants that they were policed and subject to raids by authorities in informal car washing sites like this one, as much as it was their capacity as workers in the informal economy. So raids would occur here and people would be threatened with detentions or, yes, deportations if they didn't clear out their informal car washing materials. So there was a kind of dovetailing of a logic of urban cleansing and renewal and a logic of migration policing, and it was kind of difficult to disentangle the two and to say whether it was by virtue of being undocumented or by virtue of being a worker in the informal economy that people were subject to policing. And most crucially, migrants themselves would interpret these experiences in the same ways and using the same reference points. They would say, well, sometimes we're policed because we're working in the informal economy, and then other times it's because of papers, but it seemed to be a single logic of control and containment from their perspective. And I'll begin to wrap up by talking about just how this got me thinking about the informal economy in more general terms and its mechanisms of reproduction, with reference to many scholars in development studies and anthropology, Tanya Murray-Lee, Kalyan Sanyal, Alessandra Mazzadri, who all view the informal economy not as this outlier to a capitalism that is otherwise defined by formal wage-labour relations, but as constitutive of capitalism in the global south. To make this a little bit more concrete, in order to regularize your status in Mauritania, you need to have a fee that's equivalent to about €75. You need to have a residency contract, a work contract, all of these things which are out of the grasp of the majority of migrant workers in the country. So in this sense, migration policies might be constitutive of illegality, but so too is the informal economy constitutive of the condition of illegality. To reach this conclusion of how the racialization of territorial belonging and the global informal economy's production of a surplus population are what constitute the condition from which externalization policies draw illegality, I had to foreground migrant agency, right? Whether it's people's decisions in Rosso to leave Europe as a destination point, or people's way that they conceptualize their experiences of informal migration and informal economy policing, it was necessary to foreground people's own agency. But something didn't really sit right with me, foregrounding migrant agency while also not asking how people understand their own agency. And once that question is posed, it became apparent that you can't really answer it without, you're immediately confronted with the presence of the divine. The way that people understand their own agency in this context and many others is always with reference to the divine in some way, shape or form. And there are a bunch of examples that are given in an ethnographic vignette and a concluding ethnographic chapter, which felt analytically necessary to integrate in this discussion of migrant agency and autonomy. So I'll try and bring a lot of these different threads together, and apologies for running slightly over time, with some concluding reflections. And these are things running from the findings emerging from the analysis of my data to more kind of admittedly speculative future research interests. The first is that if border externalization policies produce this condition of migrant illegality and, as Anderson suggests, justify their own existence in the process, they do so by drawing this condition of illegality from a more general pre-existing condition of a racialized surplus population. So the combination of the colonial racialization of territorial belonging and capitalism's tendency in the global south to produce a surplus population in the form of a vast urban informal economy. The second is that if this shows how colonialism is constitutive of the form that externalization takes through the legacies of race that it has left, externalization also in a certain sense reflects a collapse of the Eurocentric universalism that is embodied in the Mediterranean center-periphery boundary. So this assumption that universal Europeanization is possible and necessary seems to have perished both in the Mediterranean and in the Sahel. And lastly, there may be glimmers of a non-Eurocentric universalism within the agency and subjectivity of illegalized, racialized migrants. And this is building from the reflections on how people interpret their own agency with reference to the divine, which in the book is conceptualized through the universalist ontology of Ibn Arabi that was introduced at the start of the presentation, and which is the kind of opening conceptual frame for the book. So I'll leave it there. I'll thank you once again so much for the invitation and the attention, and yeah, looking forward to questions and comments.